Hello and welcome back to Morning Voice ASMR. Today's video is a little bit different than normal. It's a bit of a study along with me, if you will. So the whole point of this being is I'm studying for a topic that is incredibly boring. The current chapter is 19, Risk Management Processes and Concepts. So if that doesn't just excite you, I don't know what else will. So as you can see here, I'll be taking some notes as I'm studying along. I'm not a big note taker, so it will be pretty minimal. And just a real quick shout out, if my font is bothering you, I'm sorry, but I always use this font because you can tell the difference between uppercase I, lowercase l, and the number 1. They're all very different. Drives me crazy when I can't tell which one is which. So let's go ahead and get started. I've got the textbook open in another tab, but I'm not going to show it because, I don't know, I feel like that would be a copyright issue, and I like to avoid that if possible. So skipping the introduction page because who even reads those? Let's talk about risk management processes, and just bear with my typing. I'm not the best typist to begin with. So let's start with a definition. Risk management is a process for identifying, assessing, and mitigating vulnerabilities, careful in my spelling, and threats to the essential functions that a business must perform to serve its customers. And full disclaimer, I know normally when you're studying and taking definitions, you're not supposed to just copy it word from the book. You're supposed to read it and put it in your own words. But I figured it would be much more entertaining to listen to me read it out loud than to listen to me think about it. Not that either of those are especially entertaining. And I will summarize this a bit because this is a lot of text, but it looks like it takes place over 5 phases. Phase 1 being identify mission, essential functions. So it says mitigating risk can involve a large amount of expenditure, so it is important to focus efforts. Effective risk management must focus on mission essential functions that could cause the whole business to fall if they're not performed. Part of this process involves identifying critical systems and assets that support these functions. So I think that's good. Let me just say, identify critical systems and assets that support essential functions. A bit repetitive there, but number 2 is identify vulnerabilities. And because I don't want to anger anyone with detail-focused personalities, I'll make those eyes consistent. For each function or workflow, starting with the most critical, analyze systems and assets to discover and list any vulnerabilities or weaknesses to which they may be susceptible. So to me, this is basically saying, take inventory of known vulnerabilities, weaknesses for each function workflow. Number 3 is identify threats. Identify threats. For each function or workflow, identify the threat sources and actors that may take advantage of or exploit or accidentally trigger vulnerabilities. Honestly, that's so self-explaining. I'm just going to leave that blank. In fact, I think I'll just type the words twice, just because why the heck not? Number 4 is analyze business impacts. The likelihood of a vulnerability being activated as a security incident by a threat and the impact of that incident on critical systems are the factors used to assess risk. There are quantitative and qualitative methods of analyzing impacts and likelihood. So just, I'll say, take into account likelihood and, let me say, an impact of that incident to assess risk. I think that'll be sufficient. Scrolling down a bit, excuse if you see my mouse starting over, I've got my second screen up. Identify risk response. For each risk, identify possible countermeasures and assess the cost of deploying additional security controls. Most risks require some sort of mitigation, but other types of response might be more appropriate for certain types and levels of risk. So again, I think it's pretty straightforward. So identify countermeasures for risks and their costs. Most risks will require some form of mitigation. For each business process and each threat, you must assess the degree of risk that exists. Calculating risk is complex, but the two main variables are likelihood and impact. Taking down some definitions, likelihood is the likelihood of occurrence is the probability of threat being realized. Impact is the severity of the risk. Is the severity, I see, if realized as security incident. And then this is usually determined by the value of asset or cost of disruption, compromise. Okay. Risk management is complex and treated very differently in companies and institutions of different sizes, and with most different regulatory and compliance requirements. I think I added the word most extra there. Excuse me. Most companies will institute enterprise risk management. Let's make a note. Enterprise risk management. Let's look up the exact definition of that. So that is defined as the comprehensive process of evaluating, measuring, and mitigating the many risks that pervade an organization. So most companies will institute enterprise risk management policies and procedures based on frameworks such as NIST's Risk Management Framework or ISO 31K. These legislative and framework compliance requirements are often formalized as a risk and control self-assessment. I'll go ahead and jot that down. Assessment, I think I need an extra S there, but that's fine. Legislative and a framework. Compliance requirements. Often formalized as this. And RCSA is an internal process undertaken by stakeholders to identify risks and the effectiveness with which controls mitigate those risks. RCSAs are often performed through questionnaires and workshops with department managers. The outcome of an RCSA is a report. Up-to-date RCSA reports are critical to the external audit process. So let's make some quick notes on that. RCS, internal, done by stakeholders, usually done via questionnaires. Oh goodness, my spelling. I have autocorrect disabled just because I'm a horrible person and I enjoy making grammatical errors in my daily life. And the outcome is a report. Great. So let's move on to, and I'll even underline this to be fancy, risk types. So general types of risks can be identified as arising from specific threat and vulnerability scenarios. So we have external. External threat actors are one highly visible source of risk. You must also consider wider threats than those of cyber attack. Natural disasters such as the COVID-19 pandemic illustrate the need to have IT systems and workflows that are resilient to widespread dislocation. The most critical type of impact is one that could lead to loss of life or critical injury. The most obvious risks to life and safety come from natural disasters, person-made disasters, and accidents such as fire. So I'll just say highly visible and possibly most critical impact. Internal risks come from assets and workflows that are owned and managed by your organization. When reviewing internal risks, it is important to remember that these can be classified as malicious and accidental or non-malicious. Internal threats can include contractors granted temporary access. So, comes from assets, workflows owned by organization, can be accidental or non-malicious. Multi-party. Multi-party risk is where an adverse event impacts multiple organizations. Multi-party risk usually arises from supplier relationships. If a critical event disrupts a supplier or customer, then your own organization will suffer. These are often described as ripple impacts. For example, if one of your top 5 customers goes out of business because of a data breach, your company will lose substantial revenue. Organizations in these supply chain relationships have an interest in promoting cybersecurity awareness and capability throughout the chain. So, one company security event impacts others in a chain format. Let me say fashion. As an illustration of how risk assessments can change in view of multi-party relationship, consider a company that makes wireless adapters originally for use with laptops. In the original usage, the security of the firmware upgrade process is important, but it has no impact on life or safety. The company, however, earns a new contract to supply the adapters to provide connectivity for in-vehicle electronic systems. Unknown to the company, a weakness in the design of the in-vehicle system, allows an adversary to use compromised wireless adapter firmware to affect the car's control system. The integrity of the upgrade process now has an impact on safety and is much higher risk. Intellectual property or IP theft. I'll just put IP. Intellectual property is data of commercial value that is owned by the organization. This can mean copyrighted material for retail, software, written work, video and music, and product designs and patents. If IP data is exfiltrated, it will lose much of its commercial value. Losses can be difficult to recover in territories where there are not strong legal protections. Software compliance and licensing, excuse my spelling. Breaking the terms of the end user licensing agreement, or EULA, that imposes conditions on installation of the software can expose the computer owner to substantial fines. License issues are most likely to arise from shadow IT, where users install software without change control approval. Network inventory management suites can report software installations on each host and correlate those with the number of license seats purchased. Licensing models can also be complex, especially where virtualization and the cloud are concerned. It is important to train the administrative staff on the specific license terms for each product. Make sure employees have valid license susceptible to shadow IT. Legacy systems. Legacy systems are a source of risk because they no longer receive security updates and because the expertise to maintain and troubleshoot them is a scarce resource. That makes sense. Moving on. Quantitative risk assessment. There are quantitative and qualitative methods of performing risk analysis to evaluate likelihood and impact. Quantitative risk assessment aims to assign concrete values to each risk factor. SLE, single loss expectancy. The amount that would be lost in a single occurrence of the risk factor. This is determined by multiplying the value of the asset by NEF, which is an exposure factor. EF is the percentage of the asset value that would be lost. ALE, annualized loss expectancy, the amount that would be lost over the course of a year. This is determined by multiplying the SLE by the ARL, annualized rate of occurrence. It is important to realize the value of an asset does not refer solely to its material value. The two principal additional considerations are direct costs associated with the asset being compromised and consequent costs to intangible assets, such as the company's reputation. For example, a server may have a material cost of a few $100s. If the server were stolen, the costs incurred from not being able to do business until it can be recovered or replaced could run to the thousands. In addition, that period of interruption where orders cannot be taken or go fulfilled leads customers to look at alternative suppliers, resulting in perhaps more thousands of lost sales and goodwill. The problem with quantitative risk assessment is that the process of determining and assigning these values is complex and time-consuming. The accuracy of the values assigned is also difficult to determine without historical data. Often, it has to be based on subjective guesswork. However, over time and with experience, this approach can yield a detailed and sophisticated description of assets and risks, and provide a sound basis for justifying and prioritizing security expenditure. Quality risk assessments. Qualitative, I totally butchered that title. Qualitative risk assessment avoids the complexity of the quantitative approach and is focused on identifying significant risk factors. The qualitative approach seeks out people's opinion of which risk factors are significant Assets and risks may be placed in simple categories. For example, assets could be categorized as irreplaceable, high value, medium value, and low value. Risks could be categorized as one-off or recurring and as critical, high, medium, and low probability. Another simple approach is the heat map or traffic light impact matrix. For each risk, a simple red, yellow, or green indicator can be put into each column to represent the severity of the risk, its likelihood, cost of controls, and so on. This approach is simplistic, but does not give an immediate impression of where effort should be concentrated to improve security. FIPS 199 discusses how to supply security categorizations to information systems based on the impact that a breach of confidentiality, integrity, or availability would have on the organization as a whole. Potential impacts can be classified as low, minor damage or loss to an asset, or loss of performance, though essential functions remain operational. Moderate, significant damage or loss to assets or performance, or high, major damage or loss, or the inability to perform one or more essential functions. So I didn't put anything here because I feel like all of that was pretty common sense, self-explaining. So let me add a very important note and move on. Risk management strategies. The result of a quantitative or qualitative analysis is the measurement of inherent risk. Inherent risk is the level of risk before any type of mitigation has been attempted. In theory, security controls or countermeasures could be introduced to address every risk factor. The difficulty is that security controls can be expensive, so you must balance the cost of the control with the cost associated with the risk. It is not possible to eliminate risk. Rather, the aim is to mitigate risk factors to the point where the organization is exposed only to a level of risk that it can afford. The overall status of risk management is referred to as risk posture. Risk posture shows which risk response options can be identified and prioritized. For example, you might identify the following priorities: regulatory requirements to deploy security controls and make demonstrable efforts to reduce risk. Examples of legislation and regulation that mandates risk controls include SOX, HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, the Homeland Security Act, PCI DSS regulations, and various personal data protection measures. High-value asset, regardless of the likelihood of the threats. Threats with high likelihood, that is, high ARO. Procedures, equipment, or software that increase the likelihood of threats. For example, legacy applications, lack of user training, old software versions, unpatched software, and running unnecessary services, not having auditing procedures in place, and so on. Risk mitigation or remediation the overall process of reducing exposure to or the effects of risk factors. If you deploy a countermeasure that reduces exposure to a threat or vulnerability, that is risk deterrence or reduction. And once again, that is deploy countermeasure that reduces exposure to threat or vulnerability. Risk reduction refers to controls that can either make a risk incident less likely or less costly, or perhaps both. For example, if fire is a threat, a policy strictly controlling the use of flammable materials on site reduces likelihood, while a system of alarms and sprinklers reduces impact by hopefully containing any incident to a small area. Another example is off-site data backup, which provides remediation option in the event of servers being destroyed by fire. Risk avoidance and risk transference. Avoidance means stop doing the activity that is risk-bearing. For example, a company may develop an in-house application for managing inventory and then try to sell it. If while selling it, the application is discovered to have numerous security vulnerabilities that generate complaints and threats of legal action, the company may make the decision that the cost of maintaining the security of the software is not worth the revenue and withdraw it from sale. Obviously, this would generate considerable bad feeling amongst existing customers. Avoidance is not often a credible option. Transference, or sharing. Assigning risk to a third party, such as an insurance company or a contract with a supplier that defines liabilities. For example, a company could stop in-house maintenance of an e-commercial site and contract the services to a third party who would be liable for any fraud or data theft. Specific cybersecurity insurance or cyber liability coverage protects against fines and liabilities arising from data breaches and denial of service attacks. Note that in this sort of case, it is relatively simple to transfer the obvious risks, but risks to the company's reputation remain. If a customer's credit card details are stolen because they used your unsecure e-commerce application, the customer won't care if you or a third party were nominally responsible for security. It is also unlikely that legal liabilities can be completely transferred in this way. For example, insurance terms are likely to require that best practice risk controls have been implemented. Risk acceptance and risk appetite. It is not possible to reduce risk to zero, so part of risk posture is concerned with managing what risk remains. Risk acceptance means that no countermeasures are put in place either because the level of risk does not justify the cost or because there will be unavoidable delay before the countermeasures are deployed. In this case, you should continue to monitor the risk as opposed to ignoring it. Residual risk is the likelihood and impact after specific mitigation, transference, or acceptance measures have been applied. Risk appetite is a strategic assessment of what levels of residual risk is tolerable. Risk appetite is broad in scope, where risk acceptance has the scope of a single system. Risk appetite has a project or institution-wide scope. Risk appetite is constrained by regulation and compliance. So let's make a note. Risk appetite is project, institution. That is not how you spell institution. Scope-based and constrained by regulation and compliance. control risk. Control risk is a measure of how much less effective a security control has become over time. For example, antivirus became quite capable of detecting malware on the basis of signatures, but then less effective as threat actors started to obfuscate code. Control risk can also refer a security control that was never effective in mitigating inherent risk. This illustrates the point that risk management is an ongoing process, requiring continual reassessment and reprioritization. Risk awareness. To ensure that the business stakeholders understand each risk scenario, you should articulate it such that the cause and effect can clearly be understood by the owner of the asset. A denial of service risk should be put into plain language that describes how the risk would occur and, as a result, what access is being denied to whom and the effect to the business. For example, as a result of malicious or hacking activity against the public website, the site may become overloaded, preventing clients from accessing their client order accounts. This will result in a loss of sales for so many hours and a potential loss of revenue of so many dollars. A risk register is a document showing the results of risk assessments in a comprehensible format. The register may resemble the heat map risk matrix shown earlier with columns for impact and likelihood ratings, date of identification, description, countermeasures, owner route for escalation, and status. Risk registers are also commonly depicted as scatterplot graphs, where impact and likelihood are each on an axis, and the plot point is associated with a legend that includes more information about the nature of the plotted risk. A risk register should be shared between stakeholders, executives, department managers, and senior technicians, so that they manage the risks associated with the workflows that they manage. And that's the end of the chapter. That material was incredibly dry, so I'm hoping that at the very least you're relaxed right now. But again, thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to next time. Have a good night.